Hi folks, welcome to this short video about how to take care of your underwater housing and camera from me, Phil Metcalf at Alpha Marine Photography. This video is been put together at the request of our friends at Roots Red Sea to show to their rental customers who are renting TG cameras and housings from them. But it's also relevant to anybody who's just starting out with taking a camera and housing underwater. So I'm going to go through just some very basic things that I recommend you do. The first thing I'd want you to be aware of is when you've got a housing, the thing that generally causes leaks that let water in are things like dirt, sand, hair getting on the O-ring. Now I've got a separate video on how to clean O-rings, but you can do a lot to prevent getting things on the O-ring in the first place by just doing one simple thing, which is keep your underwater housing closed as much as possible. So if you're not in the process of putting the camera in the housing or taking the camera out of the housing, keep it closed up, keep it locked up. You don't need to have the housing open. The only exception for this is if you're flying. So obviously rental customers, you shouldn't be flying with someone else's housing if you're rented it where you're diving. But anybody else who's just bought a housing, if you're flying, it's a good idea to kind of just leave it open or take the O-ring out and put it in a clean plastic bag, because sometimes they can kind of seal shut a bit with the changes of pressure and be a bit hard to get open again. Depends on the design of your housing, but it can happen. So just a warning there. Okay, so keep the housing shut as much as possible. When you have had the housing open and you're going to put your camera in it, in a well-lit place where you can see, preferably with a clean surface so you're not going to risk getting hair or dirt or something on the O-ring. Before you close it up, have a look around the O-ring and make sure that there isn't anything visible on it. Generally, leaks are caused by hairs and things. Often you can, if you do get a leak, when you open the housing up, you'll see straight away the cause of the leak, and it's through carelessness, not checking these things, that you get this happen. So check your O-ring, pop your camera in housing, make sure it's all lined up, close your housing up. Now, most good housings will snap closed like that. They'll have a latch that locks into place. If you're using one of these Olympus TG housings, it also has a little safety catch as an extra lock. Don't worry too much if you have a housing that doesn't have this, as long as it closes nice and positively, and the catch to unlock it needs a fair bit of sort of active input to get it open. Your housing will be fine. There's lots of different brands of housings that I use that don't have this extra lock, but it's an extra bit of security just in case somehow something pushes and opens that latch. Okay. Before you put your camera in the housing, I would say make sure that you've got enough charge in the battery. Make sure you put your memory card in. People do forget these things. And then once the camera's in the housing, take a test shot. So make sure, that's just to make sure that everything's aligned correctly and that you can turn the camera on and take a picture. It also will prevent you getting in the water without a memory card in the camera, things like that. Okay. Once your housing is closed up, what I suggest is if you have access to a rinse tank, so a tank of fresh water, is pop the housing into the rinse tank and just check that there's no obvious leaks. So you waft all the bubbles off it and see if there's an obvious stream of bubbles coming up. Rotate the housing so that you can check all angles, because sometimes a small amount of air leak might cause bubbles to come out underneath or not show up because the water's coming up from below and not causing bubbles yet. So rotate the housing. Some housings have moisture sensors. If a tiny bit of water does get in at this stage, then the moisture sensor will alarm. If you would take it out of the housing, out of the rinse tank, have a look at it and make sure that there's no water now visible inside the housing. If all is well, you're ready to get in the water. When you're getting in the water, I tend to get in, if I'm jumping off a boat or rolling backwards off a boat, I have my camera with me. It's pretty, with just a camera and housing, it's pretty unobtrusive. I'm not going to go into big camera setups and things like this. We're talking about the basic camera and housing here. So if you want more, I do run courses on underwater photography where I go into vastly more detail on all kinds of subjects. So if I'm doing a giant stride, I hold the camera up so it's kind of the last thing to hit the water. So I my buoyancy, my body will slow everything down. It's not going to get a very hard impact, but as is good quality housings like this, they can stand hitting water at a fair pace. So don't worry too much. Don't be too nervous about getting in. As long as you've closed the housing up, made sure it's all secure, you're not going to have a problem. My personal preference, I take these caps off completely so they're not dangling around when I'm underwater. So I take that off before I get in the water. And if I'm doing a backward roll, I'll hold the camera against my body, and I tend to hold my strap at the back because that's usually what lifts off my face, off me when I roll backwards. But your preference as to where your other hand is going to be. Some people prefer to hold the reg and the mask on. Certainly when I'm jumping, doing a forward giant stride, I'm going to have my hand on my face like that. Now, if you don't like the idea of getting in the water with your camera like that, get it passed down to you. But be aware that taking the camera off somebody and getting it secure can be the point where you're most likely to drop the camera and lose it. So just be aware of that. This is why I have it on a secure lanyard on my wrist. I've not tightened that up quite so much as I would do normally because I want to take it off in a second, but have it nice and secure. If you'd rather have it clipped to you, have something that you can kind of clip on that's extendable so you can keep it connected rather than clipping and unclipping things. That's also how people lose their cameras. So once you're in the water, you might just remember to waft any bubbles off the port, so the bit that the camera looks through. Otherwise you'll get little circles in your pictures, and then take some pictures. When you're getting out, if you're getting into a boat, you may want to pass your camera up to somebody helping on the boat. Housing a rinse with the camera still in it. Make sure you give it a sort of thorough sort of swish round if you've got a rinse tank. If there isn't a rinse tank, if there's something like a freshwater shower available, give it a rinse under the shower, but just make sure you've washed off all the salt water before it's had a chance to dry, ideally. If salt is dried onto it, you're going to need to give it a longer soak to get that to break down. What I would say is don't leave your camera and housing in a rinse tank that's being used by multiple people. That's how camera housings get damaged. That's how cameras end up getting flooded quite often, where people your camera is at the bottom and someone drops something heavier into the tank and damages it. So avoid leaving your camera and housing in there for any length of time. If someone has taken your camera setup off you to put it in a rinse tank as you're getting out, I would say go as soon as possible to the rinse tank and take it out and just make sure it's not going to get damaged. And then what I recommend is you dry the port, dry this front bit. These are often made from glass, and optical glass has this thing where if water is left to dry on it, especially salt water, and especially in hot sun or heat, it can actually mark. You can get this. It's actually described as corrosion, where chemicals in the salt water damage the surface of the glass, and it will start to look foggy. So dry the port whenever immediately after use, if you can. If you're going to take the camera out of the housing, make sure the housing is nice and dry before you do that. You don't want to drip water into the housing. It can cause damage to the parts inside the housing, the metal parts. So make sure it's nice and dry. If you're taking the camera out, particularly if you're opening compartments on the camera, make sure you're dry as well. One of the common things is people open housings up and have wet hair and drip into the housing and damage things in the housing, or drip onto the camera and might damage the camera. So make sure you're dry as well. Your hands are dry, your hair's dry. And then same thing, close your housing up. If you're had it open, make sure keep it closed as much as possible, and the same routine when you go in the water again. Now, if you have a leak, if water gets inside your housing and you notice during the dive, don't rush up. Do a safe ascent. Let your buddy know that you're going up and this is why, and go to the surface as a pair, and don't endanger yourself for the sake of the camera. Once you're out of the water, open the housing up, take the camera out, and check whether or not the camera has got water in it. Dry off the outside, open it up, see if there's water inside the compartments. If water's got inside it, take the battery out, take the memory card out. Lithium batteries and water do not mix well, so any water getting in it may cause damage, and that will damage the camera. Then leave it for a good while to dry. Dry the outside with a towel, and then leave it somewhere where it's going to dry in air, with the compartments open. If water has got inside it, I'm afraid it's very likely that the camera will fail. Either it may work initially, but eventually, especially with salt water, it will stop working. If water hasn't got in the camera, then the thing to do then is check the housing O-ring, make sure that it's clean. So if give it a good clean, and then take the housing in without the camera in and test it to see whether it's still leaking. If it's still leaking, it may well be that something is damaged. One of all the controls have O-rings and things in, so that they can be damaged. If it's no longer leaking, then you can carry on using it. Most leaks are quite small. They don't tend to damage the camera. If you're using something like a TG, like Roots have for their rental cameras, then it's got a good chance of surviving because it's water resistant as well. So certainly, if you have a leak, don't think, oh, that's it, I can't, the housing is broken. Just make sure you clean the O-ring and then take it in and test it. Okay, that's a very short sort of synopsis with some tips and a bit of advice. If you'd like to learn more about underwater photography, we run a number of courses specific for camera types. So we run one for TG camera users, one for compact camera users, and one for mirrorless camera users. Drop us an email at info@alphamarinePhoto.com if you'd like more information about that, or go to our website alphamarinePhoto.com. Thank you very much for listening.